You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host in New York City, Ankit Panda.
And Prashant Parameswaran from Washington, D.C.
How are you today, Prashant? Good to be back with you.
Good. How are you doing?
Good. And we are, here today to talk about recent developments in ASEAN's diplomatic relations with regional powers and within the grouping itself. And the context here is the recent meeting of the ASEAN defense ministers, the ADMM, and the associated ADMM Plus meetings, which bring together the 10 defense ministers from ASEAN along with other countries, including the United States. U.S. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis was recently in the region. And, we've done a few episodes this year talking about the range of security issues that ASEAN's been contending with, everything from the South China Sea, and certainly the specter of terrorism that made itself known or reknown in the region with the siege of Marawi in late May, which has recently been wound down, but certainly there's a lot to talk about here. So do you want to just give us a quick rundown over the big takeaways this year from the ADMM and ADMM Plus meetings?
Yeah, I think the big one that listeners will be interested in is the fact that, after being talked about for a while, the ADMM Plus meetings, unlike ADMM, is usually held once every 2 years. But the big takeaway from these set of meetings was the final annualization of the ADMM Plus. So this, starting next year when Singapore is going to be chairing ASEAN and holding these defense meetings, will also have the ADMM Plus. So that's kind of a big advancement for the grouping. There's a number of things that have been moved forward on the ASEAN front that have been, long in the making. There's a hotline that was proposed between the ASEAN defense ministers by Brunei back in 2013. That was, finally officially announced and introduced. But I think really, a lot of this, just to give a more broader framing, it was around the issue of terrorism in Marawi, as you said at the outset, Ankit. So, when the ADMM was held, there was a breakfast meeting on terrorism and the Islamic State. There was a declaration that was issued by the ASEAN defense ministers before the ADMM Plus meetings. And I think, listeners will also be interested in, a lot of the other regional and global issues that were discussed at the ADMM Plus. And I think two of the ones that will be of particular interest is one on North Korea, which everyone was interested to hear what Mattis was going to say because, Trump, as we discussed in a previous episode, is going to be going to Asia. And so that was one big issue. And the other one was the South China Sea and maritime security. Here, no big takeaways necessarily from the ADMM and ADMM Plus, but a lot of the big things, as you and I heard at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, is going to be during Singapore's chairmanship, right? They're going to announce things like, an agreement on air-to-air encounters. There's going to be an ASEAN-China maritime exercise. So Singapore's chairmanship looking ahead is going to be a really interesting development looking forward.
So 2018 is really the big year to look forward to then when it comes to defense cooperation among the ADMM Plus countries.
Yeah, absolutely. I would definitely say that. I think the other thing that would be interesting from that perspective is, there's a lot of uncertainty now about the Trump administration that's coming into office. So a lot of the U.S. security initiatives, even though there's a lot of continuity, there hasn't really been built out in terms of a broad security vision that the U.S. has for the region. And I suspect that, we discussed this earlier too, Xi Jinping coming out of the Party Congress and China looks to be a lot more sort of in a more confident mood to roll out a lot more economic but also security initiatives for Southeast Asia. So next year is going to be interesting to watch. And the Singaporeans have had a little bit of trouble in their relationship with China and managing the U.S.-China relationship. So their chairmanship will be very interesting to look at.
So, when it comes to North Korea, which I think you correctly pointed out that's obviously the top button item right now in all of Asia Pacific security, and especially as Trump goes to Asia. Even looking outside the ADMM, just looking at ASEAN countries as a basket, we talked a bit about this when the foreign ministers met with Rex Tillerson here in Washington earlier this year. But, how do you appraise ASEAN's role on the North Korean issue? Obviously, on the ARF earlier, The grouping stood strong that North Korea should not be isolated, that it should still be allowed to participate. It's one of the few forums where North Korea's foreign minister outside of the United Nations participates in an event with representatives from the U.S. government at that high of a level. What's your general assessment of how ASEAN has been doing on the North Korean issue?
Yeah, so the ASEAN, we've talked about this before. I mean, because it's a consensus-based organization, in terms of the region-wide consensus, it tends to be sort of the lowest common denominator. So on North
Mm-hmm.
Korea, you'll usually get the usual run of statements saying that, it's a major threat to international security. We hope these provocations stop. But in terms of the actual individual Southeast Asian states, it really has been quite varied. I think on the one hand, they have recognized the fact that the United States and the Trump administration want to crack down on the North Koreans, and the North Korean behavior is quite worrying. And so there has been a crackdown on links. Good example is Malaysia, that's really been reviewing its relationship with North Korea and restricting some of those links. But on the other hand, a lot of these links are very hard to cut off, particularly in a short amount of time. And these countries are also concerned that they don't want to exacerbate things with North Korea, given how unpredictable the regime is as well. So I think there's more of a mixed record than some of the rhetoric suggests.
Mm-hmm.
But you follow North Korea very closely and the region more broadly. I mean, what do you think, and what's your sense about not just where Southeast Asia is, but also, I mean, where the U.S. is too? Because
Mm-hmm.
when Trump goes to the region, that's going to be a big issue as well, right?
Yeah, actually, let me talk a bit about ASEAN because I guess part of the reason I asked you that question is just because I was genuinely interested because I'm actually working on a research paper right now looking at regional state responses in 2017 to the North Korean issue. This is for IISS, hopefully to be released next year at the Shangri-La Dialogue again. But part of that has been, it's actually been really interesting to kind of see how the 10 ASEAN countries really have diverged on this issue. I mean, Indonesia, for example, I think is a really interesting case. A largest country in ASEAN, often seen as the primus inter pares, the first among equals in the grouping, if anything. But Indonesia has maintained somewhat its principled opposition, which is an older policy, going back to the SBY administration before Jokowi even, just a principled opposition to the idea that North Korea should be isolated. And it's been advocating for that, obviously, with the ARF. Indonesia was part of it, but also Vietnam. And both countries have taken some limited action. North Korean restaurants, I believe, have been shut down in both countries. And it's been interesting to watch the more forward-leaning action on North Korea. As you correctly noted, Malaysia is obviously a big one. We've talked a bit about the Malaysian reaction before on the podcast. Obviously, in February this year, we saw nerve agents used at Kuala Lumpur International Airport to assassinate Kim Jong-un's half-brother Kim Jong-nam, which was a major crisis, resulted in a short sort of hostage crisis where Malaysian citizens weren't allowed to even travel out of North Korea until the North Koreans received what they demanded. But Cambodia is another one that I think is an interesting case of fairly close ties to the North Korean regime, and there are a few interesting economic projects actually. There's the Angkor Panorama Museum that North Korea actually constructed for Cambodia. That's an important source of revenue. And I believe there's a long contract for that North Korea is actually going to be extracting quite a bit of revenue from that project for a while. And finally, I guess another case that I think is really fascinating is Myanmar. Myanmar, under the junta, obviously had very close military-to-military ties with North Korea, and there were years of arms exports. For example, Myanmar's Aung Zae class frigate actually uses North Korean Kumsong 3 KH-35 ship-launched cruise missiles, and it's been interesting actually that the civilian government under the NLD has been receptive to U.S. pressure on its relationship with North Korea and has demonstrated that it is willing to tamper that down, which I think is interesting, especially now given the increased scrutiny of the Burmese government from the United States as well. This is just it's just fascinating to look at these ASEAN countries, which often don't really figure in how we think about North Korea's broader relationship. But ASEAN, if you take the bloc as a whole and you look at its economic interactions with North Korea, depending on the year you look at data from, it actually ranks second after China in terms of its trading relationship with North Korea, both significant imports and exports. And
Yep.
Obviously, if you look at individual countries, it drops further down. But countries like Thailand, for example, have pretty significant economic ties with North Korea as well. So I don't think that the United States is really wasting its time by pressuring ASEAN on this. But as we've talked about before, it's just that it can generate a bit of resentment among ASEAN countries being sort of condescended to and told what to do on their relationship with North Korea, especially when many of them prize their independence and are principled about the idea of North Korea not being isolated.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the other interesting thing about the links between North Korea and Southeast Asian states is, as similar dynamic as we see with China. I mean, these corporations and individuals and links are quite shadowy, and they're often funneled through third parties or third countries, right? Like a good example of that is the fact that, for example, some of the financing that goes to North Korea, some of it is directed through Singapore, right? And it's a similar case that we see with Myanmar as well. So a lot of these things are a lot more complicated than and the other case that's important is Malaysia as well. I mean, the Malaysian government's been talking about severing economic links with North Korea, but if you look at the trade data carefully, I mean, there's a big difference between exports and
Hmm.
imports,
Hmm.
right? So this is definitely something fascinating to look at country by country, because I think you can really get a granular sense of where the relationship's at.
Yeah, yeah. So it's been pretty illuminating to work on this project actually, and I expect there's a lot more that I have to dig into here
Yep.
on ASEAN relationships with North Korea. But I did want to dig in a bit more, Prashant, into the issue of
Hmm.
terrorism, which is obviously something that is at the top of the agenda for many of the ASEAN states. Certainly, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Malaysia, which have started trilateral patrols, coordinated patrols in the Sulawesi Seas, with both terrorism and piracy on their minds. Where do you see kind of? Well, I guess let me rephrase this. So, are we at a phase where ASEAN countries are sitting down and effectively reflecting on the lessons that they've learned from the Marawi siege this year, which obviously involved foreign fighters, really seemed to come out of nowhere. Early on, there were some intelligence gaps and I guess misapplied intelligence, at least in the Philippines. So where are ASEAN states now, especially those three, when it comes to the issue of terrorism in that area?
Yeah, so you're right to frame it in terms of, there's sort of the regional response in terms of how these states look at the terrorism threat, but then there's also a lot of activity on the sub-regional front. So the trilateral patrols in the Sulawesi Seas is the prime example. So between Indonesia, the Philippines, and Malaysia, that you know we discussed this before as well, and it was discussed at the Shangri-La Dialogue last year. I mean, it's been moving much more slower than I think the states initially wanted, which is no surprise. I think there are a lot of challenges to that. But I think, the fact that this has become really a hub for activity such that it's attracted major powers, including the US, China, and others, that is testament to the fact that, this
Hmm.
is an increasing hub of activity. I think the other thing that the Marawi crisis has exposed is really how vulnerable the Philippines is as an actor, and how other states really need to step up to the plate and to assist the Filipinos, because their capacity is so limited, right? I mean, the Philippine military, there have been attempts to modernize it, but it remains one of the weakest militaries in the region, and they lack basic training, equipment, surveillance capabilities, and also the broader thing, which I think these regional actors are thinking about, and I think others, including the U.S., is, I mean, how do we deal with terrorism? And the New York attacks, another good example, right? How do we deal with terrorism in an urban warfare context where you have these incidents of copycats, and it's very easy for individuals to actually use even their own vehicles and themselves and knives rather than guns or heavy ammunition to carry out these attacks. I mean, and essentially it comes down to, I mean, where do you stand as a government in terms of how you're trying to crack down? You can respond, but I think where some governments are like the Singaporeans is, I mean, we have to stop this even when it comes to the ideology, even before these folks get their message out, right? And I think that then gets into issues of, how much do you want to restrict free speech and things like that. And I think, the big takeaway that terrorist experts always talk about is, you can't really stop terrorism entirely, because there's the enabling environment, and you really have to manage your resilience as a society. But I think, the region is also battling with how much they can take that long-term approach, but also marry that with short-term measures that are really urgently needed.
Yeah, and there's a much deeper, complex conversation to be had here that I don't think we have time for in this episode about just how radicalization is being managed by various governments. We've had a good conversation about this on this podcast about Indonesia recently,
Yeah.
and groups there that have been managing the threat domestically. But certainly, it's as pernicious a challenge for ASEAN as it is for Western countries, and certainly with many of these cities, that are highly populated, very dense, very chaotic. Often the ratio of per capita policemen is quite low, and just means that the law enforcement, the response times tend to leave something to be desired. So in general, I think there is a lot of room here for ASEAN to really do a lot of work, and I hope that process of kind of reflecting on Marawi and learning from what went wrong really gets underway. And I think an institution like the ADMM is particularly well positioned to facilitate some of that exchange.
Absolutely.
Right, Prashant. I think we'll clip this one here today, and we have a lot to look forward to with Trump's trip to Asia. So why don't we plan on doing something on that? There'll be lots to review, certainly on the North Korean issue. I know I didn't get into what the U.S. is doing on North Korea, but I have a feeling that we're about to get some valuable data on that when Trump is in Japan, South Korea, and China especially. So thanks a lot for joining me today.
Yep, good to be with you.
All right, and if you like what you heard on the podcast, do make sure you subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you have subscribed but you haven't left us a review, please do so. It really helps get the word out about the show. And we'll be back soon with more. Thanks a lot for listening.